Age of Fission radio show with your host, Lonnie Clark. We stand together and accept that we now live in a world transformed by Fukushima. Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time here on UCY.TV radio. We relentlessly engage every ear that listens. We expose and confront the complete lack of accountability for the nuclear industry. Consider social engineering programs who view our bodies, minds, and souls as assets on a balance sheet. We discuss vital current issues, interview activists, and engage our audience in an effort to allow all voices to be heard. The Age of Fission radio show creates a venue that all will choose. We encourage our listeners to reclaim their power and their courage to take action and save our planet from the ravages of greed and indifference. Our actions matter. Every voice matters. We remind our listeners that happiness is resistance. Love is greater than fear. Good morning, UCY.TV radio listeners. This is Lonnie Clark with the Age of Fission radio show. Thank you for joining us. It is 8 o'clock in the morning here. It's October 31st, 2017. We're just about done with this year. I'm really delighted to have back with us Kai Huschke from the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. We don't have much time, so I want to get right into it. Thank you, Kai, for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, and happy Halloween. I'm guessing we may have some scary topics to talk about today.
Yes, only they don't end today. That's the bad part. The bad news is it's never going away. We have to be in for the long run, longer than a marathon. So that's the issue. Look, I had sent you an email earlier when you asked me what you wanted to talk about, and on my mind is what is apparently a new assault on our environment by this current administration. And there are some things that are happening. Frankly, previous administrations weren't very good, but these guys have just made a full frontal assault on everything, going after it, really with the benefit of corporations in mind, right?
Yeah, I think that's probably an accurate assessment of a lot of what's happening in all kinds of realms, social realms, economic realms, environmental realms. Yeah, I think, there's the question, you and I spoke a little bit before getting on the air here about, the sort of the immediacy, what do we do, which is valid, and definitely we can get into that. But then the question of, why are we even in this position in the first place? What kind of system do we have here that allows these kinds of levers to be pulled in the way that they're being pulled now? Isn't that maybe an opportunity to really look more deeply at, how are decisions made, how's government ordered, and maybe it's time we understand we've got to go deeper than just mobilizing when these crises pop up and, move from crisis to crisis, as it often seems to be around, activism these days.
So what you're talking about is rewriting the Constitution?
Well, I think that's a valid question. If you look at the things that are happening today, there's obviously mechanisms built into the existing system for certain decisions to be made that are constitutionally based. So it's not as if, the current administration is just making things up. Right. They're utilizing an existing system to make decisions because they can, in large degree, because our system allows for that centralized power to be held up at that level, the federal level, which, anyone that has a cursory understanding of politics understands that so much of that level, as well as we could probably argue to say our state legislatures as well, are really the playgrounds of corporate interests. So when you already have a system that's set up to make certain corporate decisions come to life, as they really have been for a very long time, it's not just in the last 8, 9, 10 months, but that the volume can be turned up in the way that the administration has been turning up the volume. It is something that I think people need to ask themselves, why is that? Why don't we have ways of which to stop this kind of abuse of power? And maybe we need to look differently at how the power of governance is arranged so that regardless of who sits in that office, we're not subject to their whims. It's almost you rise or you fall based on who sits where and who is listening to whom. And that seems like a crazy way for any society to work, especially one that says they're a democracy.
Yeah, well, I reject that word crazy. I think it's corrupt. Crazy is one of my trigger words. Crazy and try. If you say that to me in conversation, I'm going to have to make a sidebar about that one, because those are two manipulative words, I think, that have been injected in our society. Everything's crazy. Everything is, I'm going to try to do it. Like, it's not crazy. It's super corrupt. So what's the solution? Like, when you say, how do we rearrange the governance, like, are there proposals out there, or are there ideas that we could do, or how do we affect these changes? I mean, what do you do?
Yeah, I think, going back
the world according to Kai, I guess, huh?
Yeah. Well, not just me. I think there's others that are starting to ask, not even just ask the questions, but are starting to kind of move the marker in a different direction. But I mean, if we start with the reality of certain policies, certain policy proposals, and obviously people's rightful paying attention to them, there are the steps that people are taking to make the political noise, to build the political pressure, to try to get those policies either to change from what they are and or to be stopped. And I think that's very valid in the sense of making sure things don't roll back perhaps further in a certain direction than they may already be, whether, again, it's economically, civically, environmentally. So, I think that kind of mobilization is not unjustified. And I think in a large degree from what I've witnessed out there, I think there's been some what you can call successes as far as people getting together to build that type of political influencing pressure. I think what is lacking, though, is that other piece, which is, all right, so we've sort of staved off this particular battle, but we still have a system of which that issue can pop back up, and at some point, are we going to be able to stop it? Because our ability to mobilize, to have power, takes such an extraordinary amount of effort compared to what those who have the power can do. I mean, in some ways, it's a stroke of a pen. It's a stroke of a pen for them, where it takes, people basically burning themselves out to mobilize tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people, to just voice enough opposition for it to be heard, let alone to have any force. So we have an imbalance, really, of power here that's really institutionally concocted. And so the question in my mind becomes, and I think in other people's minds, the groups we work with are often facing very similar things, of which the federal government is proposing, manifested in a different way. But, for instance, when a corporation is coming to town to lay the new pipeline, or a corporation is continuing to spray people with toxic pesticides, even though it's very clear that they need to be stopped because of the danger of that kind of practice, or whether it's even people looking to advance, workers' rights, whatever it may be, that they run into this system that is not only currently disallowing them to be a decision maker, but advances new ways of which to shut people out of governance. So I think the path that some of these people are beginning to make more visible to others is we have to have a different way of actually governing, where the power isn't so vested in the hands of the few as the way that the system operates today. The way that that's materializing is people actually asserting their right to be self-governing in their communities, and they're doing it through lawmaking. So actually restructuring law to say when communities come together to protect their health, safety, and welfare, to advance protections, to institute, newfound rights, newly asserted rights, that power needs to be the closest to where people live, which is the community level. And that work is now starting to move its way into the state realm, the state arena, which looks to actually change state constitutions to allow and to secure that power. And if you were to put that idea in practice, if it was truly actually protected by our legal system in the way that it really should be today, if you have an administration that comes in like Trump's administration, or even a state legislature administration that moves in a way to erode or pull away rights or pull away protections, if the local actually has greater power to assert protections and rights, you can see how you basically stave off the ability of a legislature or Congress to have universal power over people when the local actually has the ability to either stay their ground where they're currently at or advance greater protections, even if the federal level or the state level tries to advance something that undermines protections. So you can see how it begins to balance out the playing field about what governance is about, who it's for, and really where power sits. And I think the question is,
doesn't that require constitutional amendments at the state level to allow community rights?
Yeah, I think there's two tracks here. One is the legislative or constitutional amendment piece, whether it's about the self-governance amendments to state constitutions, or maybe even a bigger picture and the more real picture, if we're honest about where we sit today, which is, the environment, the ecology of the planet, also needs to be looked at quite differently when it comes to the law.
Yeah.
And in that arena, people are moving rights of nature laws into place here in the United States and internationally to say that we got to stop treating nature as a thing, as property for us to use or really abuse. And so these rights of nature legal structures are also starting to come into view. So, yeah, I mean, it's going to take...
And I think humans go along with that rights of nature thing because, I mean, humans are part of nature. We're not part of nature. And for they're decimating us along with everything else.
Yeah, I think the legal stuff often, in some ways, is a detriment, because people begin then to make, well, you can't do that because it's not legal or it's unconstitutional, or how does that work? People get into the mechanics of sort of the legal realm. But the truth is, we need a massive sea change. We need a cultural shift of a magnitude perhaps never seen before, at least in, the last, 500, 600, 700 years, let's say, at least when it comes to this part of the world. That's what it's going to take. And so then if it's going to take a massive shift of that magnitude, the question is, how do you do that? And if you start to look at how movements build to shift large systems, societies, governance, and so on, the most successful ones have come when they've actually changed, the makeup of the governing documents, whether it was the revolutionaries, whether it was the abolitionists. But that law itself can serve as really the great accelerant for culture change, for behavior change. And so in some ways it's about, if you want to look at it at numbers, a small few driving a new framework in, which then forces the rest to catch up to that new framework, including this idea of rights of nature being that new framework, because we're pretty well screwed otherwise. I mean, talk about scary. If we continue to sort of, if we continue as business as usual, as the way business wants to do it, as well as if all of our mobilizing is merely trying to stave off the rollback of even current protections, it's not enough. It's just plain not enough. And we've got to dig deeper, which means we have to analyze what we're really up against, organize differently, and begin pushing really this, a new paradigm, because the way that things have been operating, not again in the last just year, but really for the last 200 years, have been killing us. And it's been slowly perhaps at first, but man, it's accelerating. I mean, just again, environmentally, look at what happened in Oregon and Washington and other parts of the country just this summer around wildfires. Look at the hurricanes, look at just, counted
the
number
heat
of
in
natural
California
disasters.
Right now. It's October.
The heat
It's
in California
degrees right now. It's
I
ridiculous.
mean, Mother Nature is in some ways, I don't know what's being said, but I mean, one view could be, she's screaming at the top of her lungs, like, do you not see? Do you not hear?
Well, what, Kai?
How many more warning signs can I give you?
Wait till we get a 10-foot rise in the seawall, and they can't stop it. And in the United States, they have not prepared and built dikes or anything. And one of these nuclear power plants goes permanently underwater. Then what happens? 2 or 3 of them. I mean, this is the thing. You are completely right. So what do you say to people who say that government is the problem? Because I hear that all the time, like, government's the problem. We need, this is not what we need. What we have is, what do you say to those people?
Yeah. I mean, they're not totally incorrect. I think it's not the complete picture. It's a holistic system here. Just like nature is one big system of which we are subsystems of that larger system. I think that's, again, where the analysis of where government comes in, how that interacts with, the corporate interests, how that interacts with the judicial, all of that stuff, we have to begin to really peel it all back. And I think in some ways throw away our assumptions about things and really, look at the facts of how things really work and work in tandem. And I can't remember what the word you said earlier, but, you talk about, I guess, corruption. And in some ways it's organized corruption in the sense that the system works in the way that it was designed to work. And unfortunately, it's about aggrandizing very, very few with its benefits, the way in which government operates at the expense of the many, including obviously human populations, but the rest of nature. And so it's a larger picture of things, and I think that's part of the issue of why we haven't moved into maybe a greater movement of sorts to begin to change the structure, because people get locked down in, they want to go after a single corporation. Hey, Exxon is a bad player here. Let's pour all energy into going to Exxon. And again,
or an industry, coal or nuclear or whatever. Everybody's fragmented on their own little powwow.
Yeah, and again, the inclination isn't wrong. I mean, sure, people who are violating, rights. Forget about, the law as it stands. When they violate fundamental rights, well, of course they should be prosecuted. But the problem then becomes we are, again, limited in our ability to organize because we don't have the same resources. Can we continue just to do the lower in the stream system stuff all the time? I would say no, because the accumulation of all the effects of that downstream stuff is, rightfully in our face. That we've got to focus upstream, to the headwaters here. And if we change things from that vantage, we actually begin to change, again, the culture of the system, really the power structure as it sits, so that, for instance, I got a call the other day with some people in city of Portland who've been fighting for a while now on a Superfund cleanup site, and the various things talking about the current administration. The EPA wants to perhaps delay things or sort of diminish the amount of effort that would go into the cleanup that's necessary there. But again, it's all just the legacy pollution stuff that people are having to contend with. And then again, all the mobilization going in just to see if, the so-called cleanup can happen, which is also questionable about what does that really mean, to what degree, what happens to all that toxic material, where does it go? So, again, I understand where people come from in the sense of trying to hold people to account, but I think we're way past that. We have to stop the nasty stuff from starting at all. That takes a very different sort of tact that we have to take to begin to get there than just trying to clean up the nasty stuff from years ago, let alone hold the current polluters to account.
Well, how do we hold them back when it seems like every person in Congress, every person, I mean, it's almost like a good guy goes to Washington and then they're sort of, like Jeff Merkley to me is a perfect example. His first piece of legislation that he wanted to submit was an amendment to the Price-Anderson Act that was suppressed by Ron Wyden and Mitch McConnell. Since then, he's become somewhat of outspoken progressive just because he's felt emboldened by the racism, and it's easy to be an outspoken progressive with this administration. But prior to Trump, he was pretty much in the closet. So how do we move forward when it seems like everybody that is a decent human being goes to Washington that could make a change? Like Cynthia McKinney got chased out. They get squashed.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Are we talking revolution here?
Well, I think in a way, I think there's different ways to have revolution. Again, I think it comes from understanding that those worlds are highly toxic. And I think we fool ourselves often believing that if we elect the right person, if we just get the right person elected, we'll be fine. That's the standard kind of recipe. But I think your case in point is a good one. Like, all right, so someone was a quote-unquote good person, they get into that environment, and suddenly they're not either able to do what they said they would do, or they have changed because that world changes you. So I think it's the understanding that in some ways, in simplistic form, those people aren't going to save us. So we have to sort of understand we have to save ourselves. And so I think that means building something new. It may mean building a different kind of political force that isn't beholden to the current way that politics is run, which most likely is going to have to start from the ground up, because our ability to crack, state legislatures or the Congress at the moment is, slim to none. Yeah. So I think it's about building a real political force from the ground up. I think that could come from, basically developing our own politicians who in some ways, we have to develop ways perhaps for them to be inoculated from, the diseases of the current system. But also understand that
what about
we may have to...
third party? I mean, do you think I've heard so much that third parties don't work in this form of government, but I think that is a false statement. We don't have to just accept these two toxic parties. I mean,
I think that's true. I think it's just a matter of how they're built and who runs them and really what's going on. I mean, again, if we dip back in our own history and we look at political parties around major social change, which was attached to constitutional change, the abolition of slavery, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that ratified the Constitution, around one being, of course, the abolition of slavery. Well, those, politically speaking, got to that point within Congress because of a group called the Radical Republicans. So you had a subset of, what is, I guess, maybe more seen as the Democratic Party today, but it was the Republicans back then. But yeah, they had to build their own political faction. But the ability to have political force at that level only came because of stuff that happened on the ground prior to that. And I'm not just talking about the war itself, but the organized abolition that took place, the building of social consciousness, societal consciousness to violate things like the Fugitive Slave Act. In some ways, what needs to be built is a growing amount of disobedience to illegitimate law. And I think that's the thing missing in large form today is people haven't
the Snowden thing. Like Snowden, he basically did that himself. It was an illegitimate law, and he said no, just like Chelsea Manning. Like, she was not going to keep her trap shut when she saw something egregious. And in fact, I think that's where our country's kind of gone the biggest awry. The concept of how it was established, I don't think that altogether bad. It's pretty functional, but it requires integrity for people to speak up and have honest dialogue.
I would challenge you a little bit on that. I mean, there's that element, of course, but again, when we talk about it being systemic, it is systemic. I mean,
I get what you're saying. It's written in it. Yeah. It's written in there to make it advantageous that, in fact, the government must acquiesce to corporate needs. It's written in the. This is how they got Citizens United, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's one example. I think the other way to look at it is it's awfully difficult to get the system to bend to do what we think it should normally do already, which is, protect the rights of people, and I would argue the rights of nature. The system is predisposed not to want to do that. It's had to do that to some degree only because we built enough political force to make it do that. But even that kind of stuff is vulnerable still, which again goes back to the question of, do we have the right makeup of a constitution, let alone the way government operates, let alone how does the legal system work? Because we took all that stuff basically from the time of the height of the colonial powers. We took the legal system, we took really the form of governance from that time, and we all know what the purpose of the colonial powers were. So, we shouldn't be surprised at the amount of destruction, devastation, and really death that has come because, well, it's the very same system that did all that, for 200-300 years in a different form. But really that's continuing today. And most people may just be like rolling their eyeballs now saying, well, this guy's, what is he talking about? But that is the system. And knowing what we know today, especially around the environment, is it really the kind of system that is going to be able to do the work that the Earth demands, let alone, human populations demand? And if you really look at it closely, you're going to come to the conclusion that it can't. It's just not possible. So that means something new has to come into place if we're actually going to, fight for our own survival.
So are you secretly working on the new constitution for the Cascadian Nation, and then we can negotiate with the United States for them to accept our constitution, and then we'll stay with them so they can have all of our money?
No, I think it's just the opposite, which is the beauty of the possibility here, which is that writing is actually happening out in the open, and it's happening from people. Which is the exact opposite about how other things have worked, which have been about a small number of largely men of property who've done things in secret. So I think what's happening now is, in places like Oregon, where Lincoln County passes a community bill of rights to ban pesticides because of having a right to, health and the rights of the ecosystems, or, communities back east, passing similar laws for the protection against the fracking industry. Those are actually the beginning portions or pieces of what a new constitution can look like. So it's been happening in bits and pieces. I think the most concentrated attempt to do sort of the new constitutional construct has come with these state constitutional amendment proposals, these rights of local community self-government, which would empower communities to hold back corporate powers, which would then embolden or secure the ability of localities to move higher rights and protections than whatever the state or federal may be at the time. Mm-hmm. And then it also puts a restriction on the local governments to say, well, you can't drop below whatever protections and rights may have already been secured by those higher levels of government. So it's not about cutting localities completely loose. It's about having them still attached to the deeper purposes of government, which really are about rights and protections. But it does enable then the localities to move higher law forward. So, for instance, now back to the beginning topic, if the federal government wants to roll back all these federal environmental protections, well, if we have the ability locally to say, well, that's good and fine if you want to do that, but we have a higher standard here, and if anyone's going to operate in and around where we live, they're going to have to adhere to this higher standard because our rights and protections are actually above that of the federal government. So you begin to see how the federal actually has to hold true to what the local says when it comes to actually increasing rights and protections, which is not how it works today. I mean, in simple form, everything is very centralized, and the notion here is we need to decentralize.
Okay, but how do we deal with these multinational corporations who have no problem murdering people?
Yeah, like I said earlier, it's not going to be easy.
Therein lies
I don't
the
know.
problem.
Yeah, well, I don't know exactly what the future will hold. I think this is why also, the increase in direct action, for instance, has come to bear because the legal system isn't catching up to the realities of what we need. So I think it's about analyzing what we're up against, needing to understand we have to build various fronts to confront the existing power dynamic, and then confronting it directly, which is, I think, another shortfall of where most activism goes today. It operates really in an indirect way, which is largely about, the influencing piece or the writing the comments piece, or back to your, Merkley example. We write all these letters to Congress expecting these individuals to do our bidding when it's very clear who they do the bidding for. So why do we expect the results when they come out in opposite of what we are advocating for when we know how the system really functions, even though we're told that these people are our representatives? So I think it's about shaking that kind of stuff loose. What else will emerge, I don't know, but I think the more honest we are about what we're after, and the more direct we are in the way that we go about doing it, that's eventually what shifts power. But until we do that,
the way the locals coming together and organizing and making these demands as a collective group emboldens the federal and state officials to stand up to what, these forces. I mean, Merkley, I don't think Merkley's a bad person. He's about as good as it gets. But the issue is I've seen him, he went in there gung-ho, ready to go, and he is tempered now. You can see there's times when they let his flame go, and there's most of the time like he's, you got to keep a lid on it to be politically sound. Otherwise, these multinational corporations, I mean, we're expecting in Lane County for them, and Pete DeFazio by no means is, in my view, a good hardcore progressive. He negotiates an awful lot on the wrong side of the fence for my liking. But the Republicans are going to spend probably 35 to 40, maybe more millions of dollars in Lane County alone to defeat him. So how do we stand? I mean, we have to, and if we ran a third party, a really good alternative person who was really on the right side of everything, their money could, you know what I mean? Like this is how the third party never comes into play because people are so afraid to vote for the third party. They're going to vote for the best rotten apple. You know what I mean? Our choices are two rotten apples. You got to pick one with a little bit of good stuff on it still.
If I look at the electoral world, I would not be putting much effort into the state or the national at this point. I would be looking at actually building it again from the ground up, getting people in municipalities, counties, port positions, places where you actually have a greater chance of being successful, and beginning to pack those arenas as much as possible. So it's not just one person.
So that you can pass the community rights issue, so they don't get a lot of hostility.
You begin to have many elected bodies then turning against the illegitimate system, and when it's done in a collective like that, it becomes much harder to ignore, and it becomes clearer to the people about how bad the system is when their people do what they do and are being punished for doing it. I think that's what builds the political possibility then to begin taking over the next levels. I think it's awfully difficult to believe that, running another person to then end up in, the state legislature, even, let's say, at this point in time is going to mean much because there's really nothing underneath it then. And I think the examples, again, it's a different time, different period about when you talked about corporate power, but you think about the revolutionaries, and I'm not talking about, the armed conflict itself, but, what actions people took in the communities to basically throw off British rule. And they physically removed various elected officials, or not, I should say appointed officials from the British government. I mean, they physically removed them from office and then took over. They declared independence. They eventually, of course, declared independence collectively. But that wasn't also not just about throwing off the king, or the British form of governance, but it was also about tossing out the East India Company, because, they dominated the colonies. So, in some ways there's parallels today where we have these multinational corporations dominating our everyday, pretty much everything we do. They do largely what they do because they are legally protected to do it. They've built the system, which is really their system. So we have to begin to, I think, defy that system and then build the new system simultaneously. And it may mean also doing what we were just talking about, which is making sure that people who sit in elected positions are really doing the bidding of the people. And I think the best place for that to happen is still going to be local, because the people actually have access to the local officials. You mentioned Lane County. When those local county commissioners were trying to mess with the people's initiative process, people came out in force. And I was at one of those meetings where people gave those guys an earful, and they were literally pinned back in their seats. Again, these were people who were oppositional, what I would say, to the people's business. But just imagine if you had people in there that were really willing to do the people's business on a deeper level. That would scare the out of the corporate world, as well as elected officials at other levels, because that starts to have real force. But you know what happens when you do that? This is the hard part. We had somebody in Lane County. We had Rob Handy, who, I helped him canvass. It was a big turnover. We had never had a Democrat take over that seat, and he was a very honest person. In the course of his tenure, his only term that he served, they were brutal. They accused him. They made false accusations. Said horrible things. It's taken him 5 years to settle the case, exonerate himself. It was just exhaustive. So that's what I mean. Is like, it's not that easy just to get somebody elected, because again, I've seen, it's almost like we're living in this rotten stew that it's really difficult to just climb out of. I think there's two things there. I agree with you. That's why I was saying just electing one person isn't going to do it. You need to clean house. So the approach has to be different. But also the understanding is, if your people get in, they actually have to redo government itself. It's not enough just to get in there to do whatever they can do with the current system. They got to chuck that and put a new system in while they're there. Because if you think about it, if you actually reordered government in the way that we've been talking about it, it becomes this check on the power of the electeds too, because they're actually beholden to a different standard than they are currently today. So in some ways, it wouldn't matter who's in office, because you have something basically constitutionally written in such a way that it wouldn't be able to be abused, or abused as easily as it can be done today under the current system. So it's going to take, I think, a couple different things happening. And yes, it's not going to be easy. But I think the only way it becomes possible is if people begin to try it. And, to some degree that is happening around the community rights world, where people are beginning to try that change, and understanding that it can't be just rested on electing the right person, but they got to change the very documents of which those people operate from, because otherwise it's just too easy for the system basically to consume those good people. And then nothing to really show for it for the people or for the environment itself. So I think it's about, running up, if we talk about political parties, a new platform that's about this new form of governance that's needed. And that's the platform, and that's the order of business that those people get to when they get into office. So that they're not going to be, vilified and attacked in the way that you just described with the one Lane County person, and then that's their whole tenure is just trying to defend themselves. Yeah, that's not going to get us anything at all.
You know, it's almost like community rights and human rights, like community rights and nature's rights. That's what I meant. Getting nature's rights asserted goes almost hand in hand with community rights. I mean, they really are logically. You were correct about this. If we really are going to save our planet, essentially, we really must assert the rights of our Earth against the corporate ravages of itself. You know what I mean? We're already seeing catastrophic events and deaths, and I mean, I don't know if we can save our. Frankly, I mean, do you know who Guy McPherson is? Have you heard of him?
I've heard the name.
He's a speaker who goes around. He was a professor of biology or something, some sciences like that. And when he realized about 8 or 9 years ago that, oh my gosh, he quit his job and set out on a journey to let people know, like, look, we're past the point of no return. Humans are probably not going to last another 100 years because we're on the trajectory. We don't have time to turn ourselves around, so just enjoy your life. Oh my gosh, people were so mad at him. But I say it's worth the attempt to save it. For me, it's a point of dignity and honor. Like, we cannot just go, oh, well, let's just destroy the Earth because we know we're on a trajectory that's going to end us all in 50 years anyways.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, quickly back to your community rights. When I say community rights, that is what I mean. I don't mean just human communities, but also the rest of the other natural communities and, the planet itself, basically. So
yeah,
I think that is something we have to understand. And then, yeah, I mean, you only do this stuff if you have some sense of belief that change is possible. Otherwise, yeah, you just say, well, screw it, I'm gonna, take a long extended vacation. But yeah, I think the notion here is that we can do it, people can get it, but it's going to take a lot of effort. And I think it comes with, first and foremost, people believing it's possible. And I think if people believe it's possible, and then people come from the vantage point of, what does the Earth demand? What do we demand? What do we need? That's another huge piece versus what will the system provide for us, or what will the system, spit out to us, ditching that whole organizing realm and getting to a new one. And then, building that new movement to make it possible is what's going to be necessary. And everything we've talked about around how difficult it is exactly true. Because, I mean, the basic notion is if somebody or something has power and you're trying to wrest that power away, that thing isn't just going to, eventually just let go. You're going to have to take it. And they're going to do everything in their power to make it known that you're going to be punished for trying to shift that power dynamic. So it's in some ways it's going to get worse before it gets better. And we have to expect that and actually use that to our advantage to wake more people up. But if we do it, I think we actually have a chance. How long it's going to take and what forms it'll come in, I don't know, but I think it's possible. Otherwise, I wouldn't be talking to you here right now if I didn't think it was possible or worth fighting for.
Me too. The same thing for me. And so we have about 15 minutes left. I wanted to direct people to your website, CELDF, CELDF.org. It's a really great site. And there's a link on here that says join the movement, organize in your community. And that basically will tell people how to get started and how to get involved, correct? That whole little link of people that are motivated by this conversation to go, you know what, I can maybe do this in my community if nothing is there. That is a good way to jumpstart it, isn't it?
Yeah, so it provides a communication link to people in different places, and our role really is to help in a couple different ways. Do a lot of what we've been talking about here in a more formal kind of educational way, not super formal, but a more organized, I should say, than just a conversation. so that people kind of get a better picture of, where our system of government comes from, why it functions the way it does, and then most importantly, what we can do to change that. And if people are then still, willing to do something, we come in then and help them get organized. We help them with, writing the laws of which they are wanting to put forward to better their communities. And then also are there to help them if and when those laws get challenged. So, we're there to help communities basically help themselves. And, but if there isn't something of which is compelling someone already to reach out because of a certain issue, but maybe perhaps heard this interview and want to learn more or get active, then, that's a great way to connect.
There's also a link that says attend an event, and you can go there and get more extensive information and really, there's events in Yellow Springs, Ohio. Those happened, Yellow Springs, but coming up beyond today's date, there's one coming up on November 3rd, Democracy School Confronting Corporate Takeover, November 3rd and 4th. Out in your way, Bellingham and Whatcom, Washington. Will you be leading that?
Yeah, actually, I'm heading out in a couple days up to Bellingham from where I live here in Spokane, and be teaching what we call Democracy School, which is sort of that unpacking of of our own history and legacy, and getting a deeper view of how people have dealt with basically oppressive systems in the past, and how people are trying to do that today. And so we teach these day and a half, pretty intensive workshops. All across the
There's
country.
Also one in Nashville too. One on the each coast, I see. And then there's something called We the People 2.0 in Broadville Heights, Ohio on November 13th.
Yeah, that's a film that a filmmaker has made about trying to depict elements of the Democracy School, but also, show real life people having these basically these standoffs with corporations and really our system of law, and how that is going and what's possible. And so I think the film is also a pretty good introduction into, being encouraged that it is possible and that we can do it. If people can either attend a screening, or if they're interested in hosting their own screening, they can go to the We the People 2.0 website or of the filmmakers and figure out how to become a film host. So there's a variety of different ways to kind of get active and get informed.
That's awesome. Well, Kai, I really appreciate this, because this is what we need, is for people to do get involved in their own because if we just leave it to somebody else, it never gets done. And so we have to figure out and search these things out and look for them and make time for them. That's what I've been doing.
It's like whatever that saying is, if you want it done right, you got to do it yourself. I think, politically speaking, I think that's where we've been for a very long time, but I think it's clearly where we're at now. So that means looking to one another, which I think is also something in which the system has been very good at convincing us that somehow, your neighbor is incapable, or the person across town just doesn't get it. I think that's a very good way to control people and to keep them, in their own homes and not actually questioning or even actively undoing the way the system functions. But it's also, I think, very true that once people understand that, my neighbor can get it, and yes, people, have a brain in their head, that's the very thing, again, that scares the what out of the power brokers themselves. When people come together, I think you said it earlier, when the fractionalization ceases and the coming together and the uniting comes together, and not just on the issues but on the structure, because almost every issue we confront is tied to that very same structure. So I mean, if you lay it out on paper, it would be logical to say, wow, if we just change the structure, then all these issues that we have passion about and want to see happen have, so much more greater chance of coming true. So why aren't we all coming together to change the very structure, so that each of our issues, has the power and the regency that it just is unable to achieve today, in large degree not because of political stonewalling, but even more so that the system isn't really set up, to deliver, a healthy environment in the way I think that we all deserve and demand, or, economic equality, or level of educational access, or healthcare, or whatever it may be. That's going to take a much deeper structural change, and it's the same structure, though. And so if we can, in some ways get out of our issue silos and focus down on that structure, things really begin to change at that point.
That's I was thinking as you're talking about that, how sacrosanct it is to change anything in this structure. The idea of changing it is considered anarchy. You know what I mean? To make a fundamental change of it, any of that would be probably called anarchy, because we want to change the rule of law. We want to change how the flow goes from corporations who really have been running the show, like you said, 500-600 years at least.
Yeah, I mean, there's some major sacred cows out there, or I would, maybe another way to state it, some very powerful myths about what things are and how they work. And those very powerful myths are the very things of which we have to be looking at, and in some ways we have to take completely apart, because they're the very things of which are literally killing us. So yeah, it's I think that's probably one of the bigger problems is those myths, those sacred cows, are in large degree what frees us from believing that it's possible, or put that doubt in our head, because the belief is that those things are sort of untouchable. I think that's where the shift can happen, and the speed of which change can happen is when more people understand that that's exactly what we have to let go of. I mean, if you look at any other people's movement, they didn't, for instance, go to the Constitution for their justification of political outcry and mobilization for something new. They stood on the Declaration of Independence, because of what that document said, and not what the Constitution said, because the Constitution is not the Declaration. But we often conflate the two or mix the two up.
That's true.
That's part of that shift, that we have to look to different places, and it's not as if we need the Declaration for justification for change. We have enough facts out there to demand it ourselves without needing to point to that document. My point, though, is things like, we've brought it up a few times here, the Constitution isn't all what it's made out to be, and we have to be willing to really look at it, versus sort of put up our defensive posture and believe that it's some sort of document that should be protected at all costs, when the truth is, it was something written in the 1780s, and we're in the years 2000s now. No one can argue that we're in a very, very different time, and that perhaps that 1780s document isn't sufficient for what we need today, and that it has to be looked at, and that we shouldn't just say hands off. I mean, no other country on the planet has had a constitution longer lasting than ours, even though people who were part of that advocacy process and who were, in positions of power of upholding it, like Jefferson. I mean, Jefferson said basically the Constitution should be rewritten every 17 years. Of course, we haven't done that. So I think that's one of the big myths that has to be exploded here if we're going to have any chance of reaching the kind of world I think that you and I can probably envision in our heads and still believe is possible.
Well, you know what, actually, the Declaration, it's funny that you bring that up, because I remember sending this in to, I think, a letter to the editor, and actually changing the name to King George W. Bush. But we could read this reason for the Declaration of Independence today, and it almost feels exactly the same somehow. And This is why what I learned from you in democracy school is the reason that's happened is because we sort of created the British rule of law in the United States. They sold us out. By putting corporate rule over the needs of the people. That's exactly what the
Yep.
Declaration of Independence speaks to.
Yes, but you could totally go pull that up, and where it lists out the complaints, the 27
Right.
complaints against the
Yes.
king, you can switch the king out for the corporate state, for instance, and just read it as is, and it'll be eerily similar to what we're dealing with today.
It is eerily similar. I mean, and it almost doesn't even matter who the president is.
Yeah.
He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. I mean, seriously.
So, as we said, today's show would be frightful, and as you also mentioned, it would go way beyond just midnight tonight when Halloween ends.
Yeah, and this is the thing. It really does. I do hope people will go to CELDF and participate, and because it is going to take all of us in whatever little grotto that we're in, wherever. And if you're in a larger city, there's a likelihood that there are activists already there. I mean, even here in Eugene, there's a group that I am in contact with now. So there are groups, and I was stunned the first. I only recently heard about it, and when I went to the meeting, the room was full. Although I do have to say, that was kind of my last quick question, if I could get to that. Are there student organizations involved in this? Because I'll tell you, I was stunned when I went to the meeting here in Eugene, and almost everything that's involved with political efforts, at least on the West Coast, I haven't seen any younger students involved.
Yeah, it's been an issue. It's something that's changing, which is fantastic. I think part of the issue has just been, the system is so good at indenturing people literally with debt. So if you're a college student, let's burden you with hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt so that when you get out of school, well, the system forces you to have that be your highest priority. So I think life in the system is very good at keeping some of the younger folks politically inactive. At the same time, there's an effort right now in Bowling Green, Ohio, to put a community bill of rights in place that would ban a pipeline project that's coming through that area. And that was all put together and really pushed through by students at the university in Bowling Green. And, we as an organization have talked about, and with all the groups we work with, about upping the connection and the mobilization of more youth, college students, and others. So, yeah, that is a very big thing.
I think if they would grasp this, I mean, I found out about college, but unfortunately none of the students came. So that was kind of a shock to me. I was in a class with probably 80 students.
Yeah. So I think there's,
we do have some challenges on this, but you know what? Like, I think that it's just going to take, I don't know what it's going to take, just role modeling or continuing to do it and keep believing that they're going to show up sooner than later. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I mean, that has to happen, and there's work happening there, and I think that's another hopeful piece, that if they get involved, they get it, and they get active, that begins to be, again, some real power beyond those who are already committed to doing this revolutionary work.
Exactly. Well, you know what, Kai, thank you for joining us. We have 30 seconds. I'm going to be calling you up and asking you to come back in a month or two. I hope you will join us again.
I'd be happy to. Thanks for making time again.
Oh, man, it's awesome. Thank you for your work. Thank you for helping us save our planet and for all we do. And I encourage everyone, put your courage feet on, take action, and figure it out. Go to CELDF.org, CELDF.org. Bye, Kai.
Yep.